So first, I'd like to thank the HUC-JIR Cloud Library for inviting me to talk to you today, to have this conversation about work that I really just genuinely love. The library is an important and key academic and public resource at HUC, and I'm happy to be part of this larger attempt to bridge the sort of academic world with the rest of y'all. So my talk today is how to use Psalms, ancient Jewish and early Christian perspective. So first, let me offer a warning, an apology. I am not going to be telling you how to use the Psalms. Not my job. I'm a historian. What I will be exploring today is how ancient Jews and early Christians used Psalms, how they worked together and in conflict around this really interesting and important book. So if you have personal takeaways from the historical research, kol hakavod. But I am not here to be prescriptive. All right, so our conversation today is going to be broken up into 3 parts. Part 1 will be our core concepts. We're going to discuss ancient Judaism, early Christianity, the idea of convergence, conflict, polemic, and piety. Part 2, we're going to talk about how conflict moves to convergence using polemic as a tool. It'll make sense after we talk about the core concepts. And part 3 of our talk will be the opposite direction, where we move from convergence to conflict, using the lens of piety as a way of exploring this dynamic. So that's going to be the outline of our conversation today. Let's begin. Let's talk about ancient Jews and early Christians. All right, so this is part of a much larger, broader, complicated conversation. But by ancient Jews, I mean the Jews that lived after, in this case, after the Second Temple. So the Second Temple was destroyed around 70 CE, and a little bit before as well, through around 600, 700, what we tend to call the Talmudic period, the rabbinic period. Of course, not every Jew in the rabbinic period was a rabbi, or even necessarily followed the rabbis. So we're going to explore this briefly explore this larger swath of ancient Judaism. So that's category number 1. We're going to create categories, and then we're going to frustrate those categories. You'll see. And the second group, or peoples, or identity, that we're going to be discussing are early Christians. Of course, in the earliest periods, right, during the times of Jesus and his first followers, there were no Christians. There were Jews who followed Jesus. Over time, in this period, what scholars tend to call late antiquity, right, the post-70 through 500s, 600s, we start to see the coalescence of a Christian identity, or rather truly multiple identities, that builds upon, contrast with ancient Jews. Now, of course, I've just presented you with a dichotomous fallacy, as if there are ancient Jews and early Christians. Except, as we'll see, and as we'll see from the source on the screen, the confluence between these two groups were, well, the borders were not yet set, certainly not like they were in the Middle Ages and possibly the modern period. And I want to sort of thematize the sort of tension and border crossing, blurry boundaries that one sees between ancient Judaism and early Christianity from a source by the church father, John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom lives in, you see on the screen, 349 to 407. He's living in Antioch, which is in Syria, right? It's a little bit north of Eretz Yisrael. And his last name, at least, or the name that was given, Chrysostom, is Goldenmouth. He was a widely popular preacher. He wrote a ton. And during one of his sermons, or as he was preparing one of his sermons, he noticed among his flock a troubling trend. And what you see is an excerpt from one of his series of sermons called, of course, Against the Jews. So I'm going to read this, and we'll see how, at least on a popular level, identity can be a little bit of a complicated thing. What is this disease? The festival of the pitiful and miserable Jews who are soon to march upon us, one after another and in quick succession. The Feast of Trumps, he's talking about Rosh Hashanah. The Feast of Tabernacles, right, Sukkot, and fasts, which he probably means Yom Kippur. And this is the key line. There are many in our ranks, namely Christians, who say they think as we do, yet some of them are going to watch the festivals. And others will join the Jews in keeping their feasts and observing their fasts, right? So what you have among Chrysostom's flock, at least, right, are Christians who are really interested in synagogue. I wish to drive this perverse custom from the church right now. My homilies against the Anomians, other Christian group, can be put off for another time, and the postponement would cause no harm. But now that the Jewish festivals are close by and at the very door, if I should fail to cure those who are sick with the Judaizing disease, I'm afraid that because of their ill-suited association and deep ignorance, some of the Christians may partake in the Jews' transgressions. Once they have done so, I fear my homilies on these transgressions will be in vain. For if they hear no word from me today, they will then join the Jews in their fasts, and once they have committed the sin, it will be useless for me to apply the remedy. Right, so what John Chrysostom is pointing out, or the pressure that he's feeling, is that there are Christians who are really, really interested in Jews and Judaism. And the inverse is probably true as well, at least for the Christians, certainly as so far as much as that they're going, Christians are going to church, are going to shul, right? That's from Chrysostom's mind, that shouldn't happen. So on a popular level, right, there seems to be, and there are other sources that prove this, and we can talk about this further later, the borderlines between Jews and Christians, at least on a popular level, among the masses, not entirely firm. But what I want to do today is talk about conflict and convergence as identity mechanisms on even those who are elite. Identity is a really complicated thing. And drawing on many scholars and theorists, right, identity is something that is constantly created, then deconstructed. Identity is cyclical. One creates differences and then collapses those differences in a cycle. And the way I sort of want to express that in our time and conversation today are the notions of conflict and convergence. That even the Christians and Jews, rabbis and church fathers, who are the most invested in creating the distinctions between Judaism and Christianity that eventually won out the day to some degree in our modern period, right? Even those elite members of society who are interested in creating boundaries are actually not doing what they think they're doing. And there's actually quite a bit of overlap through the notions of conflict by creating conflict and then convergence. And more importantly, conflict and convergence are overlapping. So what we'll see throughout the conversation today is that even when presented with direct conflict, underneath the hood, so to speak, one also finds convergence. And underneath the hood of convergence, we also find conflict. So conflict and convergence will be our mechanisms of identity and identity formation. But I want to concretize this a little more by talking about two ways in which Psalms were used in this great dance of conflict and convergence. The first is polemic. Polemic, literally polemos, right? War, fight in Greek. On the screen is the sort of Merriam-Webster definition of polemic, right? It's a strong verbal or written attack on someone or something. And of course, in a more religious context, it often means the art or practice of engaging in controversial debate or dispute. By polemic, right, we will see examples of church fathers claiming the Bible means something and the rabbis being like, no, actually it means the exact opposite. You guys are wrong. And of course, therefore, idiots. So we will see conflict most visibly in polemic. But what I'll show is that even in the context of polemic, you're going to get convergence. You're going to get something that looks like both in both theoretical religions start to overlap and shape one another. The second category that I want to we'll talk about today is piety or psalm piety. What you see on the screen is a working definition, and piety will be our primary convergence, under which we will also see conflict. So as a provisional definition of psalm piety consists of a series of psalm-based practices that are primarily non-exegetical, so non-interpretive in nature, and are manifest across various social classes. These practices, which include reading, reciting, touching, and speaking verses in the Psalter, are not legislated a priori by a legal system. They develop from the bottom up, and even if legal sources eventually canonize a particular act of psalm piety, or commented on the appropriateness or desirability of it. These practices are performative, strategic, and often, but not always, iteratively enacted. In this manner, psalm piety resembles, and sometimes becomes attached to, other forms of activities that are themselves embedded in the cultural symbolic ritual system, such as liturgy. Okay, so that's definition. Now, if you want sort of the heuristic, right, you go into Jerusalem, you get on a bus, And if you look around, if you see any often Haredi or a seminary girl sitting on a bus, they have a Sefer Tehillim, a Psalter that they're piously reading from. That's just one heuristic definition of Psalm Piety. Right? No one's telling this person, you must read Psalms, but that's what you do. That's piety. All right, so those are our terms, right? So ancient Judaism, early Christianity as potentially overlapping and some conflicting identities. Then the idea of conflict and convergence as this a dance between both poles, and we're going to explore it from the lenses of polemic and piety. Right? So now that we have our general terms of conversation set, let's now talk about examples. And let's start with polemic. So when Christians were Jews, right, before there was Christianity, and eventually even as Christianity starts to develop an identity of its own, they largely inherited the same books that the Jews had, right, the Hebrew Bible. Except, what did that Hebrew Bible mean? For many Christians, both in the ancient world and, of course, in the medieval and modern world as well, the books of the Hebrew Bible were largely, and I'm being schematic, but follow me with this, were largely prophecies and proclamations that point to Jesus and the development of early Christianity. So, for example, if you read a book of Psalms, you're not reading David's words, or you're not just reading David's words. In fact, you are also reading the words of Jesus, or a prophecy about Jesus. Where this actually pertains to a modern world, and I thank the organizers for inviting me to this talk, because the entire talk is only for the purpose of the following slide. This was on the news. 3/16/2021, Israeli dollar store mistakenly sells New Testaments instead of Psalms. And a pull quote is a cut price stock chain, Israel's version of the dollar store, Mac Stock, found itself embarrassed recently when tiny books festive wrapping labeled Psalms in Hebrew turned out to be miniature New Testament. So, right, you have a little pocket Tehillim, at least it says it on the outside, but you open the pages and what's in the inside? It's the New Testament, right? It's the emblematic prophecies and about the life of Jesus and the future of the church. This is a nice heuristic about the many ways that ancient Christians, and probably some modern Christians as well, conceptualize and think about the book of Psalms. So let's take a look at one example of this in action, right? One example in which one way to read the Psalms, especially for Christians, is really about prophecy, right? It's future looking. And we're going to do that from a little piece of New Testament called the book of Hebrews, the Epistle to the Hebrews. The Epistle to the Hebrews is a wonderful and complicated sermon. Unfortunately, we are limited in time, as always. The key argument for Hebrews, well, a key argument for Hebrews is that Jesus is the ultimate, in both sense of greatest and final, high priest, right? One no longer needs the sacrifice of the temple. One no longer needs the blood of animals. One no longer needs high priests and the priesthoods. Why? At least according to the book of Hebrews. Well, because you have Jesus. Jesus was the last high priest. Jesus is the ultimate high priest. And because Jesus is a priest, you don't need other priests. So let's take a look at just one little quote from the book of Hebrews. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Good quote from Psalms. And this is going to be the important line. As he also says in another place, "You are the priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek," right? So according to the book of Hebrews, and this verse appears like 4 or 5 times throughout the entire text, Jesus is a priest forever, and he's a priest forever in this order of Melchizedek, right? Which is strange and weird, but it's a quote from Tehillim, so it's good and it serves as fodder to prove for Christians that there is a prophecy in Psalms that points to Jesus. Of course, your Jew who does not believe in Jesus is not going to take that lying down. And in fact, we have good evidence that Jews very much did not. And one piece of that comes from Leviticus Rabbah 25:6. In this case, as we'll see, the author, or the Baal Midrash, Rabbi Yishmael in this case, seems to be aware of something like the claim that Jesus is a high priest, and instead flips the tables. Rabbi Ishmael taught, the Holy One, blessed be he, intended to bring forth the priesthood from Shem, son of Noach, as it's written, and he, Melchizedek, was the priest of the Most High God. So in rabbinic literature and among other places, Shem and Melchizedek are the same person. But because he, namely Melchizedek, gave precedence in his blessing to Abraham over God, he brought it forth from Abraham, as it is written, and this is quoting from Bereshit, and he blessed him and said to him, blessed be Abraham of the Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High. Right, so notice what he does. First is Baruch Avraham, and second is then you bless God. So Abraham said to him, is the blessing of a servant to be given precedence over that of his master? Right, dude, you got your orders of blessings wrong. This isn't fair. This isn't right. So what's the consequence? Straight away, it, namely the priesthood, was given to Abraham. As it's written, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. This is followed by, and the Lord has sworn and will not repent, because you are a priest forever, after the order al divarti Melchizedek. You, in this case referring to Abraham, are a priest, because of the words of Melchizedek, namely, because, according to the Midrash, I will summarize it, because Melchizedek misspoke, and because he blessed Abraham before God, his words, davar, Melchizedek lost the priesthood, and it no longer followed his line, the line of Shem. Instead, the priesthood was given to Abraham. Right? So remember, of course, this is a historical reading of that very same verse. Right? If the Christians are reading the verse prophetically and using it to prove that that Jesus is the high priest, right? Jews have a comeback. This is a case of polemic in which Jews then say, well, actually, no, we're reading this historically. And not only that, we're reading it historically in a way that makes your claim, namely that Jesus is from the order of Melchizedek, entirely impossible, right? Because Jesus can't be a priest in the order of Melchizedek because Melchizedek did not get the priesthood. What happens though, right, is that's the conflict. But there is a little bit of a convergence here too. Namely, what we now have in rabbinic literature is the idea of Abraham as a high priest, right? It's a piece of interpretation that probably wouldn't have been generated if not for a polemic, and now creates new forms of thoughts. Because remember, the rabbis were, Abraham, of course, sacrifices on altars, but he's rarely ever considered a high priest. He's only considered a high priest now because of this larger polemical conversation with Christians, right? So there's a conflict, but now we're thinking of two key historical characters as high priests. It's one example. Let me go for another one that has a little bit more texture to it. And this is Jesus, and particularly with respect to his crucifixion as recorded in all four Gospels, but I'm focusing specifically on Matthew. So if we unfortunately don't have time to read the entire text, and it's interesting and fascinating and has a lot of pathos, right? Pathos, i.e. suffering, which is where the word passion comes from, hence the passion of Christ. But if you read the text carefully, one will notice that Psalm 22 is cited or referenced 6-7 times throughout the entire crucifixion story. It is fairly clear that for Christians, Psalm 22, and we'll see evidence of this a little later, Psalm 22 is not just words of David or a lament, it is a prophecy about Jesus on the cross. And in particular, it's not just a prophecy about Jesus on the cross, it is Jesus on the cross, right? So the Psalms, once again, right, is read prophetically or actualized as Jesus. Well, we have here just two examples out of many, and you'll see the really striking similarities between the Matthew text and Psalms. So the first example, and when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes amongst themselves by casting lots, right? That's the story. But of course, if you look a little bit deeper, it sounds pretty similar to, they divide my clothes amongst themselves, casting lots for my garments, right? So Jesus seems to be actualizing or fulfilling the words that existed prior to him in Psalms. And of course, the texture gets a little more fine as we look at the most famous example in which Psalm 22 appears in the crucifixion. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, right, so it's Aramaic, which the New Testament authors then translate. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right, so Jesus, at the moment of his death, cries out, my Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And of course, this is the second verse, or really the first verse. This is the beginning of Psalm 22. Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. My Lord, why have you abandoned me? Azavtani in Hebrew, shabachthani in Aramaic. So not only is Jesus, at least according to the Gospel of Matthew and the other parallel texts, not only is his passion modeled and undergirded by Psalm 22, the very words of the psalm, the very complaint of the petitioner are Jesus's very words. Okay, so if you go to an ancient Christian and you ask, okay, Psalm 22, what's it about? Almost invariably, they'd say, oh yeah, we know that one. It's about Jesus and the crucifixion. And you don't have to ask my opinion about it. We can talk to another ancient Christian, a certain Jerome, Hieronymus Presbyter, lives 347 to 420. Jerome is a fascinating, incredible early Christian figure who we can spend hours upon hours upon hours touching on and discussing. Now, what's interesting and important for us about Jerome is he is educated in Rome, but at some point in his life, he relocates to Beit Lechem, right? So he's actually living for quite a while in Eretz Yisrael. And more importantly, Jerome, if you read his letters and if you read his commentaries, he seems to be aware, he knows Jews. He's talking to some Jews, rabbis, other Jews. He gets Jews to translate passages for him. He gets Jews to talk about exegesis with him. And if you read Jerome's many voluminous commentaries, you'll see that he often refers to Jews, some of which are probably real Jews, but also even in times where he doesn't say, oh, and I got this from a Jew, one can see traces of rabbinic and other sort of Jewish interpretations that are lining the work of Jerome. So this is what Jerome, on his commentary on Matthew, has to say about Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's a quote from the actual psalm. Impious are those who think the psalm was voiced in the persona of David, right? Or Esther or Mordecai. Esther and Mordecai are going to become important for us. For by the very testimony of the evangelist, passages from it are understood to be about the Savior. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. They have pierced my hands and feet. So what's Jerome saying? Jerome is saying, guys, I don't understand how you can see it another way. This Psalm 22, is about Jesus, right? It's right there. They divided my garments, which a line we saw earlier. Or they have pierced my hands and feet, right? Clearly that must be about crucifixion. Yet there are these impious people who are saying the psalm is about David, Esther, or Mordecai. And lo and behold, if we take a look at some Jewish exegesis of Psalm 22, right, we actually do find it refers to Esther and Mordecai. The sources we'll explore today are largely about Esther. But notice, right, from a Christian perspective, before we turn to the Jewish sources, Psalm 22 is about Jesus in general, and in particular, it's about Jesus's suffering, and specifically with crucifixion, right? And in that entire moment of his life, pretty convincing conviction, right? Of course, Jews don't take it down, just like with Abraham. Instead, when Christians read prophetically, Jews read historically. So, says Rabbi Levi, this is from Bava Megillah, the Rabbi Levi is a Eretz Yisrael Amora, when she, Esther, came to the house, so the scene over here is it's the Megillah. Esther is about to come to Achashverosh, right? We read this like a month or so ago. So Esther's gonna come to Achashverosh, she's really scared. And finally, when Esther comes to the house of idols, namely the actual chamber of Achashverosh, but it's Beit Slamim, and of course, house of idols might actually also be a moniker, an allusion to churches. So when Esther came to the house of idols, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, departed from her. At that moment, she said, my Lord, why have you abandoned me? Perhaps you judge the unintentional like the intentional, and what was done under compulsion like that which was done willingly. So namely, she's referring to having to sleep with Achashverosh, who's a non-Jew. Or perhaps, and there's a flip side of this, it was because I called him a dog, him being Achashverosh. As it says, save my life from the sword, my precious life from the clutches of a dog. Right? So, or Esther saying, maybe it's because I insulted him. Right? So instead, she called him a lion, Achashverosh. As it says, deliver me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen, rescue me. So notice what happens here. Notice the tone and the tenor of this particular midrash. Psalm 22 is not about Jesus, but it's about Esther. But it's not just stam about Esther, right? It's about Esther also as a sufferer. It's about Esther in the darkest and most dangerous moment of her existence. And as she's about to ask for favor from Achashverosh, it is at that moment, right, at the height of stress, that God seems to abandon her. Notice as well that the actual words of the psalm are not being interpreted about Esther. Right? It's not versing, they don't quote a verse and say, and this pertains to Esther because the very words of the psalm are Esther's words, right? She's not just, the psalm isn't just interpreted as Esther, it is Esther's voice. Right? Esther is the one delivering these speeches. So, right, so we see another case of polemic, right? Christians understand Psalm 22 to be the suffering of Jesus. Jews flip and say, no. It's not about Jesus, because it can't be about Jesus. But it is about our historical figure. It's about Esther. But now let's take a look at an example of where this polemic moves to convergence. And for that, let's take a look at another piece of legal interpretation by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Right? Notice the key theme of the Esther story was that Esther is suffering. Right? It's not the Jews, or the rabbinic midrash in this case, didn't merely create a polemic. In creating the polemic, it also drew onto itself a motif and theme, namely suffering, that was developed in a Christian context or in an early Jesus following context that eventually became a Christian context. And what we see in this example, what we will see in this example soon, is that that suffering motif gets carried forward. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, a person is required to read the scroll of Esther at night and repeat it during the day, as scripture says, my God, I cry by day, you answer not, by night I have no respite. This is a really strange proof text to use for the Megillah, right? You'd want something maybe more joyous, right? It seems extremely odd that the proof text for the Megillah is you cry by day, there's no answer, and by night, right, there's also no respite. It seems to be the case that the motif of suffering, which developed as a polemic, became operative as a piece of legal exegesis. At the same time that Psalm 22 morphed from a psalm about whatever it could be about to a psalm specifically about Esther and her book. Right? The conflict between Jews and Christians via polemic and interpretation, underneath it, of course, it's still a conflict, there's this moment of convergence, right? Where a motif and theme developed by Christians becomes operative and interesting and deployed by Jews, not just in the context of polemic, but even outside the context of polemic. So that's one example. These are several examples of where polemic, where conflict moves to convergence from the realm of polemic, right? So let's now flip the script and take a look at another way that identities are constructed, and that's the inverse. And that's the movement from convergence to conflict. And particularly, we're going to do so by talking about piety. Psalm piety existed as a lifeline in the ancient world. Let's hear the voice of our fair weather friend Jerome once more. I think he's being a little bit hyperbolic, but it's not entirely untrue. In his 46th letter, he says, quote, "But certainly, as we have said above, all rustic villages are silent except for Psalmody. Wherever you turn, the cultivator holding the plow handle sings hallelujah. The sweating reaper distracts himself with psalms, and the vineyard workers trimming grapes with pruning knife chants something from David. Probably a little bit of a hyperbole, but also really still true. Psalms were omnipresent. Monks who were traveling the Holy Land memorized psalms, sung psalms constantly. There are amulets in which psalms are pervasive. Numerous inscriptions in the ancient world, whether they were on gates, cisterns, doors, bore verses from the Book of Psalms. And as one example, the image on the right is a graffiti, writings of the opening words of Psalm 51 to 93 in Jabal al-Tarif, which is the site in which the Nag Hammadi codices were discovered. The Nag Hammadi codices are super important for ancient Christians. They are they're ki'ilu. They are the parallel to what Dead Sea Scrolls are for the ancient Jews. It's a group of really important ancient texts that were hidden in this case because they were understood to be heretical. But in that very cave on the walls where monks were copying and preserving these texts, there were the incipits, the beginning words of numerous psalms. In theory, monks would see these words and then be reminded of the opening words so they can recite and chant psalms. Psalms were everywhere. So what we're going to do right now is take a look at two different ways in which Psalmody, in which Psalm piety overlaps, converges between Jews and Christians. But again, on top of that convergence, one also finds divergence. One finds a little bit of conflict. The first example is mantra-like Psalm piety, namely the idea of reciting a verse again and again and again and again. And instead of me saying again, 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 let's actually look at some sources. All right, so the source on the left comes from the Yerushalmi, it's Brachot. It reads, Rabbi Chizkiah and Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha, Rav Yasa, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, really this verse should never move from your lips. Namely, you should say it over and over and over again. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge, Selah. Adonai tzivot imanu miskav lanu Elohei Yaakov, Selah. If you recognize that verse, then you probably most recently heard it during Havdalah. Rav Yossi, the son of Avin, Rav Abahu, in the name of Rav Yochanan, and the colleagues, O Lord, or Lord of hosts, happy is the man who trusts in you. Adonai tzivot ashrei adam boteach bach. Right? So these are two verses that should always be on your lips. You see them again, again, and again. Let's compare this to a form of Psalm piety, or the almost exact similar form of Psalm piety by a Christian monk named Abba Lucius. Abba Lucius is probably living in the desert, in the Egyptian desert. His saying is preserved in this larger collection called Sayings of the Desert Fathers. We can talk about it another time, but this is what Sayings of the Desert Father attributes to Abba Lucius. I sit down, so monks are supposed to pray constantly, and they're also supposed to work, right? This is attention, right? How do you work and pray at the same time, right? You're working, you're not praying. So Abba Lucius has a brilliant answer. I sit down with God, soaking my reeds, plaiting my ropes, and I say, God, have mercy on me. According to your great goodness and according to the multitude of your mercies, save me from my sin. Right? So what Abba Lucius is saying about his own practice and potentially advocating for the practice of others is to constantly repeat Psalm 51 again and again and again. The underlying structures of mantra-like Psalm piety actually converge between Jew and Christian. What one notices where one starts to see a difference and distinction are the kinds of verses that are chosen. Notice, the monk dwells on mercy with respect to sin. The rabbis, in particular in this case, right, are largely citing verses about trust in God. This isn't the only time we see this sort of dichotomy or difference between the monastic or a monastic way of reciting Psalms and a rabbinic and probably larger ancient Jewish way of reciting Psalms. Let's take a look at one more example. And this is deathbed Psalm piety. So in the ancient world, and even in the modern world, the most powerful words that one can say is right before they are about to die. I think there actually might be there's certainly a legal force to this in Jewish law or ancient Jewish law. I will not speak about American law because I do not know American law. But The final words that one says are incredibly important. And to die with Psalmody on one's lips is to die with the ultimate form of piety. So let's take a look once again at a rabbinic Jewish source on the left and an ancient Christian source on the right. So start with the Jews. Zavdi ben Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and Rabbi Yossi bar Petram said the following verses as they died. One said, "Therefore, let the exceptionally righteous person offer prayer to you at the time of going out. The rush of mighty waters shall not reach him," right? So, Eitz Mitzvah, time of going out. So it's a nice allusion to death. But what's the righteous person supposed to do as they die? Praise God. One said, "But let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them sing for joy. Spread your protection over them so that those who love your name may exult in you," right? Once again, when a rabbi dies, what's the image? Rejoice, happy, acknowledgement in securely being protected by God. And another, how abundant is your goodness that you have laid up for those who fear you and accomplished for those who take refuge in you in the sight of everyone. Notice, all three verses, right, are harping on the exact same theme, right? When a righteous rabbi dies, they can do so in joy and with the expectation that there's, a world to come in which they will be closer and more and closer to the divine. Let's contrast and compare this, right, to deathbed psalm piety. Notice again the same undergirding structure, but with a twist. The passage is from Pisidius, Life of Augustine. Pisidius was one of the earliest biographers of Augustine. And this is what Pisidius tells us, Pisidius of Calma. Augustine told us in intimate conversation that the reception of baptism did not absolve Christians, and especially priests, from the duty of doing fitting and adequate penance before departing from this life. And he acted on this himself in his last and final illness. Right? So basically, baptism isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card, and this is what Augustine did right before he dies. For he ordered those Psalms of David, which are especially penitential, to be copied out, and when he was very weak, used to lie in bed facing the wall where the written sheets were put up, gazing at them and reading them, and copiously and continuously weeping as he read. So Augustine is sitting there in his deathbed, looking up at penitential psalms, right? Psalms of suffering, sorrow, and requesting God for forgiveness. He's sitting there reading and crying. Both Jews and Christians converge in their understanding and the mechanics of their deathbed piety. Where they begin to differ, where one begins to see conflict, maybe too strong of a word, although we'll see conflict in a moment, is what are the appropriate verses to be said and sung on those moments and on those occasions, right? As in the prior sources, the rabbis are largely focusing on trust and faith in God and joy, while the Christian sources that we were exploring largely focus on penance and fear of sin. So once again, right, this is a moment with piety where we see convergence, slight conflict, but we can actually see true conflict raging in our next two sources. Our next two sources are mirrors of one another to some degree, and they will show us that the rabbis themselves were aware that Christian psalm piety and Jewish psalm piety seem to be similar, but an actual site of diverge is an actual site of conflict, in one in which, quite frankly, it's possible that Jews might actually be doing better than Christians. In the following two sources, David, king of Israel, stands in for the Jews, and Nebuchadnezzar, right, one of Judaism's most wicked enemies, largely stands in for early Christians, as he does in other places in rabbinic literature. So let's take a look at our first source. This is from Leviticus Rabbah 13:5. Rav Barach and Rav Chalbo in the name of Rav Ishmael ben Nachman. Everything David articulated in his book, namely Psalms, that wicked person included in one verse. And this is a verse from Daniel. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all of his works are true, his ways justice, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. So according to Rav Barach and Rav Chalbo, David had to write 150 Psalms, but Nebuchadnezzar, he captured the essence of it in just one pithy verse. The Midrash then goes on to compare each line of Nebuchadnezzar's praise with a piece of Tehillim. Because of time and space, we're not going to cover that. We can talk about that a little later. let's take a look at an even more harsher source that plays in the same motif. And this is from Bavli Sanhedrin 92b. Bavli Sanhedrin 92b is, Bavli is awesome. Bavli Sanhedrin is incredible. This entire section of Bavli Sanhedrin is totally wild. Everyone should go read it because it's totally wild. But in particular, it's this lengthy discussion about Nebuchadnezzar, about Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Ezekiel's prophecy. So the scene for this passage is Nebuchadnezzar sees the bones of Dura that is prophesied in Ezekiel 37 get up. And when he sees them rise, people coming back from the dead, he began and said, how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom and his dominion is from generation to generation, right? So Nebuchadnezzar starts to praise God, right? Notice, we don't like Nebuchadnezzar praising God, right? This simultaneous pious proclamation of God's greatness. Rav Isaac said, let molten gold be poured down the mouth of that wicked man. For if an angel had not come and struck him on his mouth, he would have overshadowed all the songs and praises that David said in the book of Psalms. And so we'll let that sink in for a moment. According to Rav Isaac, Nebuchadnezzar, right, the stand-in for Christians in this case, right, are doing a better job at being David, at being pious or at singing piety than the Jews themselves, right, than David himself. And it's a good thing, at least in a historical case, according to Rav Isaac, that an angel came and shut Nebuchadnezzar up. So to take it back, from the vantage of piety, right, we initially see, even among the elites of Jews and Christians, the idea of convergence, right? They're practicing some piety in very similar ways. The mechanics, the actions are roughly parallel. The content, right, where the conflict resides, slightly different. And furthermore, because in some cases, because of that parallel, because they're doing very similar things together, one also begins to see the rise of conflict presented by these two, or at least exemplified by these two sources, right? Convergence, in this case, through piety, leads to conflict. All right, so we're almost out of time. And I want to leave enough room for question and answers. So let's conclude. So what are some of the conclusions and takeaways of our conversation today? So the first thing we did was we surveyed various ways in which ancient Jews and early Christians made use of Psalms, right? So I did keep that long ago promise of how-to Psalms. So how did they use Psalms? They used it as history, right, to understand their distant past. Christians especially used it as prophecy, right, as a way to mine the scriptures of the Hebrews for a way to substantiate Jesus and the Christian identity. They used it as polemics, right? They used Psalms as a means to attack one another. And of course, they used the book of Psalms for various forms of piety, right? Whether it's mantra-like repetition of Psalms, deathbed piety, and there are a host of other forms of piety that we did not have time to discuss in our conversation today. That's number one. Number two, we explore the somewhat porous border between Judaism and Christianity on both the levels of intellectual disputation, right, polemics, right? We saw how motifs developed in polemics can get extended forward, and of course, spiritual practice, namely the act of reciting Psalms seems to put Jews and Christians on parallel tracks at the very least. And finally, we examine convergence and conflict as interlocking mechanisms that assist in the constant construction and reconstruction of religious identity, right? Identities are not stable, they're not essential, they are in constant motion, and they are constantly moving between the poles of conflict, right? Trying to assert differences, and convergence, effacing those very differences.